here, and welcome back to another reading live stream. Tonight, as you can tell from the title, I will be doing part 4 of reading about U.S. history, which I have mentioned before is one of my favorite subjects. I always like to learn about history because I'd rather learn about history and then over acting like I know about history, which I really don't like in any way, shape, or form. You know, the know-it-all type of people. I just don't really care for that, to be honest. That's why I prefer to know than to think I know. You know, if you know what I'm saying. So I will be reading this book, well, the fourth part of the book in question, and fourth part is titled American Expansion 1801 to 1861. And we all know what's going to happen once we get past this part. Because everybody in this country, in the United States, knows what takes place between 1861 and 1865. But we're going to get to that on the next part. For now, here we are with part 4 of everything you need to know about U.S. history in one big fat notebook. Let's begin. Unit 4, American Expansion, 1801 to 1861. As settlers moved west into the newly claimed territory, indigenous indigenous people were forced off their land. These changes created new tensions and increased settler violence between the groups. Against this backdrop, the continental U.S. grew to fill the borders it has today, and the number of settlers skyrocketed. Okay, should be good. Chapter 14, President Thomas Jefferson. The election of 1800. Democratic Republicans tried to paint Federalist candidate John Adams as a monarchist. Adams tried to label Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican candidate, as a radical and an atheist, a person who rejects belief in gods. Adams clearly lost, but Jefferson tied with Aaron Burr at 73 votes in the Electoral College. The House of Representatives voted 35 times, trying to break the tie. Finally, Alexander Hamilton persuaded a congressman not to vote for Burr. Jefferson became the third U.S. president and called his election the Revolution of 1800 because it was the first time a peaceful transfer of power occurred between opposing political parties. The mess of trying to break the tie led to the 12th Amendment in 1803, which made the election of the president and vice president two separate ballots. It also led to a lifelong grudge between Hamilton and Burr that ended in a duel on July 11, 1804. Hamilton died the next day of a gunshot wound to the stomach. Jefferson owned Monticello, a plantation where he enslaved more than 600 people. After he was elected, newspapers accused Jefferson of fathering multiple children with Sally Hemings, a woman he enslaved. DNA evidence has proved he fathered 6 children with Hemings. Enslaved women did not have the legal right to refuse unwanted sexual advances from their enslavers, and many women bore children fathered by men who enslaved them. Hemings' own father was Jefferson's father-in-law, the man who enslaved her mother, Elizabeth. Jefferson freed Hemings' children when they turned 21. They were the only enslaved people he freed. Hemings was unofficially emancipated shortly after Jefferson's death. Jefferson as president. Jefferson emphasized the central stances of the Democratic Republican Party. Limited government with a laissez-faire approach, focus on agriculture, political unity through individual independence. So, for anybody wondering, laissez-faire, French for leave it alone, a theory, particularly in economics, that insists on minimal government intervention. Taxes were repealed. The Alien and Sedition Acts expired. The military spending shrank, and the number of employees working for the federal government decreased. The Midnight Judges. At the very end of Adams' presidency, Congress had passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, creating new federal judge positions. Once the judges were in office, they would keep their jobs for life, so Adams made sure to appoint them before he left. Because of the last minute timing, they were called the Midnight Judges. When Jefferson became president, some of the judges hadn't yet gotten their commissions, the documents that made it official. It was the job of the new Secretary of State, James Madison, to deliver the commissions, but Jefferson told Madison, well, just not to deliver them. One of the judges left in limbo was William Marbury. Marbury v. Madison, 1803. It gets complicated and there's Latin, but it's important. Marbury took his case straight to the Supreme Court, where he requested a writ of mandamus against James Madison, which basically asked the court to force Madison to give him his commission. The Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the Supreme Court the power to settle the case. Although Chief Justice John Marshall agreed that Marbury deserved his commission, he ruled against Marbury, saying the Supreme Court didn't have the power to grant the writ and settle the case because Congress had no right to pass the Judiciary Act of 1789 in the first place, and the Constitution is the supreme law, so when the Constitution and the law were in disagreement, the Supreme Court could cancel out the law. The case of Marbury v. Madison is important because it established judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to nullify a law by declaring it unconstitutional. Yeah, it says it in the green box, but it's already explained it, so I'm not going to do it again. It made the Supreme Court equal in power and status to the executive and legislative branches. Marbury v. Madison strengthened the idea of checks and balances in the federal government and made the Supreme Court the final word on the constitutionality of the law. Western expansion. Kentucky was admitted to the Union in 1792. Tennessee joined it soon after in 1796, and Ohio in 1803. The Mississippi River was officially the western border of the United States, based on the treaty signed at the close of the American Revolution. The lands provided a buffer zone between the expanding American settlements and the existing Spanish ones. But American settlers continued the pattern first established on the eastern seaboard. They pushed west, taking over land inhabited by the indigenous groups, who in turn had to move west themselves, accommodate their new neighbors, or take a stand which might go badly for them. This push west was fueled by a desire to reach the Mississippi River, which merchants and farmers wanted to use to conduct trade. Trouble with Spain. Spain controlled the river in its major port, New Orleans, but the river did not belong to them. Spain had secretly traded the Louisiana Territory, all the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, including New Orleans, to France in 1800. But the land didn't belong to France either. The land claims were just claims. None of the indigenous nations had given this land to any foreign power or taken part in any negotiations. Two powerful nations who had acquired and mastered horses dominated the Great Plains and are credited by historians as having built empires. The Lakota Empire, sometimes referred to as the Sioux, dominated the northern plains and then Comanche Empire dominated the southern plains. Although neither Spain nor France owned the land or the Mississippi River, they coordinated their efforts to control the river's mouth and its major trading center. In 1802, Spain closed the port to American shipping. Napoleon Bonaparte, the ruler of France, was planning to expand his empire in the Americas, using New Orleans as a critical point of entry for troops headed to the country. New Orleans also controlled the Mississippi River, which was a major port of exit for goods from the American West. France, the American West. France was essentially threatening the sovereignty and economic stability of the U.S. The Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson sent Robert R. Livingston and James Monroe to France to meet with Minister Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister, to discuss buying the territory of New Orleans, but they got a surprise. Haitian leader Toussaint Louverture had led enslaved people in a revolt that forced the French out of Haiti. French troops were also decimated by yellow fever. France was losing interest in the Americas and needed to fund its war with England. Talleyrand offered to sell the whole Louisiana territory, which was larger than the entire U.S. at the time. The price of $15 million to transfer the paper ownership of this land was a bargain, roughly 3 cents an acre. In October 1803, the Louisiana Purchase extended the border of the U.S. to the Rocky Mountains. The actual cost was much higher. Jefferson violated his own understanding of the role of the federal government to make the purchase. In addition, actually taking control of the territory would involve millions of dollars in treaty negotiations with and warfare against the indigenous people living on this land. And if I remember correctly, this was not really a popular decision. It could be wrong there, but I'm pretty certain that is the case. Lewis and Clark. Congress chose Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark to lead an exploration of the West. Their group of about 50 soldiers and militia, the Corps of Discovery, Corps, a group of people acting together under a common direction, usually military, the P and the S are silent, set out to map the new land, gather information on the nations they encountered, and document the plant and animal life they found. In May 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition left St. Louis and followed the Missouri River. By winter, they had reached modern-day North Dakota. The Corps benefited from both the information that indigenous people provided and the generosity of the people they met. For example, the Corps was warned about the powerful Lakota by several tribes, and the Mandans and Hidatsas allowed the group to build Fort Mandan near their villages. The Mandans also helped Lewis and Clark recruit a translator and guide, a Frenchman named Toussaint Charbonneau. He joined the expedition along with his 16-year-old wife, Sacagawea, was a Lemhi Shoshone who had been kidnapped from her people by the Hidatsa and then sold to Charbonneau. The couple joined the group at Fort Mandan, and 6 weeks later, Sacagawea gave birth to a son, Jean Baptiste. Sacagawea was able to translate for and even guide the Corps. The presence of a woman and a baby helped the Corps gain the trust of many of the tribes they met. They didn't believe any war party would have a woman and a baby with them. Upon arriving at the Pacific coast, the group faced another difficult winter and was helped by the Chinook people. They returned to St. Louis on September 23, 1806, 27 months after beginning their voyage of discovery. In 1809, Charbonneau and the Sacagawea and their son moved to St. Louis at the invitation of William Clark. Clark then took charge of Jean Baptiste's education and ultimately adopted him. A Tale of Two Coins. During the expedition, Lewis and Clark gave the tribal leaders they met Jefferson peace medals as gifts. President Jefferson was featured on the flip side of the coin. In 2000, a dollar coin with an image of Sacagawea and Jean Baptiste was forged for the first time. Originally, the other side featured an eagle in flight, but in 2007, under the Native American $1 Coin Act, it was decided that each year the other side would feature a new image that celebrated the contributions of indigenous peoples to the development of the United States. Trade troubles. Even though the U.S. had remained neutral in the conflict between Britain and France, each of those countries tried to stop America from doing business with the other. Jefferson, who had been re-elected to a second presidential term, decided to punish England and France by cutting off their access to American trade altogether. In December 1807, Congress passed the Embargo Act, ending all international trade between the U.S. and the rest of the world. But Britain and France just traded with other countries instead. It was a disaster for American merchants and for Jefferson's image. Embargo, a government order prohibiting commercial ships sailing into or out of its ports. Yeah, I'm not going to say heads or tails about it, but I will say this much. Some of what we got going on that we had here with what Jefferson was doing here almost seems a bit reminiscent with what we got going on with Trump. I know some people are not going to like me going political, but just bear with me. In case you know, it's saying how it traded with how both countries traded with other countries instead. The tariffs that he's doing may lead to that happening to us. I'm not saying it will, because I don't know if it is happening or not, and I'm not going to act like I know that's happening, but it could. Bear that in mind. Just remember, I didn't say it is happening, just that it could if it hasn't already. Moving on! Chapter 15. The War of 1812. James Madison, the primary author of the U.S. Constitution, was elected in 1808 to take the place vacated by his fellow Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. Madison would soon face problems within the country because of expansion and encroachment on the frontier and internationally with the British. The problems were connected. The British had promised in the Peace of Paris, 1763, to leave the forts they held in the interior of the continent, but they kept them from these forts. The British encouraged indigenous peoples to resist American expansion. In addition, while at war with France, the British Navy often stopped American commercial ships, took sailors they thought were British, and forced them into the service of the British Navy. You can understand where the problems are, how those actions can be considered problematic, especially the very last bit. These acts, instigating rebellions and kidnapping sailors, led to Americans fighting a second war for independence, the War of 1812. Tecumseh and frontier conflicts. Indigenous peoples in the Northwest and Louisiana territories were determined to hold on to their land. Led by Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, who was supported by Great Britain, several tribes united to fight settlers. Tecumseh attended a large intertribal gathering in 1783, held at the end of the American Revolution, where tribal leaders met to make a plan about how to deal with the Americans. Tecumseh understood the need to unite all tribes and to convince indigenous leaders that the lands of the continent were the collective property of all the indigenous peoples, and no single tribe had the authority to negotiate land deals with the Americans. By 1810, Tecumseh was working to unite as many indigenous nations as possible. The American authorities on the frontier understood that he was a threat to continued expansion and settlement. William Henry Harrison, governor of Forrest, you know how to say Indiana, don't you? Yes, I do. I just literally said it. So I'm going to repeat that sentence. William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, sent a warning to Tecumseh, urging him to stick to the terms of earlier treaties and past agreements. Tecumseh responded that the few chiefs who signed the treaties didn't have the authority to represent other tribes and give away their land. The Battle of Tippecanoe. The first major battle of the War of 1812 took place on November 7, 1811, while Tecumseh was away, rallying indigenous nations to unite. Harrison prepared to attack Prophetstown, a settlement near the Tippecanoe River that Tecumseh built to be the headquarters of the Confederacy. Harrison's soldiers defeated the Shawnee people at the Battle of Tippecanoe. They burned Prophetstown to the ground, and Tecumseh's Confederacy never came to be. Demands for war. On June 18, 1812, under pressure from war hawks, Congress declared war for the first time. The term war hawk refers to anyone in government who supports war. The term peace dove refers to someone who advocates peace. That summer, Tecumseh and his remaining allies crossed the border into Canada to join the British forces, and later that fall, James Madison was elected to his second term as president. The War of 1812 begins. The first American plan of attack was to invade Canada, but the British and their indigenous allies seized Detroit before the Americans could head north. It was also difficult to invade Canada because the British controlled Lake Erie. Keep in mind that Canada was claimed by Britain. The reason only 13 colonies engaged in American Revolution is that the Patriots couldn't persuade colonists in Canada to join the Revolution. By September 1813, the Americans had gained control of Lake Erie. Then, in October 1813, William Henry Harrison, commanding the troops in the area, defeated the British and the indigenous allies near the U.S.-Canadian border in the Battle of the Thames. Tecumseh was killed. Although the Americans had pushed the British out of the Northwest, battles with indigenous peoples, including the Creek War, continued. The Creek War took place in what is today Alabama, where the Red Stick Creeks, following Tecumseh's lead, had asked the British for support. In March 1814, Andrew Jackson, leader of the Tennessee militia, defeated the Creek Nation in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, forcing them to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson and cede Creek/Muskogee land to the U.S. Now for what is probably one of the biggest moments, if not the biggest moment, in the War of 1812, attack on Washington, D.C. By 1814, Napoleon had fallen from power, and British forces could focus on enemies to the west. On August 24, 1814, the American troops were defeated in the Battle of Bladensburg, Maryland, which allowed the British to sail into the Chesapeake Bay. They invaded Washington, D.C., setting fire to the Capitol and the White House, and forcing President Madison to flee. The First Lady, Dolly Madison, stayed behind until the last moment to save a portrait of George Washington. The British continued up the Chesapeake to Baltimore, Maryland, intending to capture Fort McHenry. On September 13th, British warships began their attack. But because of the Americans' refusal to surrender, the British Armada eventually withdrew. The Star-Spangled Banner. Before the British attack on Baltimore, Americans raised a large flag over Fort McHenry. When Francis Scott Key, a lawyer who had witnessed the night-long bombardment, saw at dawn that the flag was still there, he was so moved that he wrote a poem to it. The poem was later set to music, and it eventually became the U.S. national anthem. Capitol versus Capitol. A capital with an A, is a city or place that is the official seat of government of a country or state. The U.S. Capitol, with an O, is a building in Washington with a famous dome and is named after an ancient Roman hill called the Capitoline. The Battle of Lake Champlain and the Battle of New Orleans. In September 1814, British forces trying to seize the city of Plattsburgh, New York, faced the U.S. Navy at Lake Champlain. The Americans refused to surrender in the Battle of Lake Champlain, and the British retreated. The British forces in the South decided to attack New Orleans. As they advanced on Louisiana on January 8, 1815, an army organized by Andrew Jackson waited. Marching in their typical style across an open field, the British were easy targets. Winning the Battle of New Orleans boosted Jackson's popularity. It was the final battle of the War of 1812, and it occurred after the war had officially ended. The end of war. The British decided war wasn't worth the time and money it cost and reached an agreement with the Americans. But the news took a while to reach Andrew Jackson and the Federalists. From December 15, 1814 to January 5, 1815, Federalists met at the Hartford Convention to show opposition to the war. Little did they know that on December 24, 1814, the British and Americans had signed the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. The Hartford Convention embarrassed the Federalists for opposing a war that had already been won. The Treaty of Ghent did not resolve border and trade disputes between the U.S. and Britain, but it increased patriotism and inspired a growing American identity. Although the treaty returned the countries to the way things were before the war, Americans were proud to have held their own. Because the War of 1812 cemented America's independence, it is also called America's Second War for Independence. American manufacturers profited since British goods weren't available. Americans decided that their destiny lay in the West, not in Canada, and the nation seemed destined for success. I just want to say real quick that, with the Hartford Convention, could you imagine if, they had TV back then and, TMZ was the thing in those times? Oh my god, they'd be roasting the heck out of them. They'd be roasting the heck out of the people who are participated in that. I already know they would. Anyway, the War of 1812 may have been the second war for independence, but it was also a war of dominance over resistant tribes. The boundaries between the United States and Canada remained unchanged, but the indigenous people of the continent lost a powerful ally because the British were no longer supporting their resistance to expansion. Chapter 16. The Young Nation Grows. After the War of 1812, feelings of nationalism, patriotism, a sense of national identity, spread through the U.S. Nationalism and the Era of Good Feeling. James Monroe was elected America's fifth president in 1816 with little opposition from the now fractured Federalist Party. Monroe toured the country and was widely supported and welcomed everywhere he went. This era was marked by so little disagreement about national politics that it was called the Era of Good Feeling. Era of Good Feelings, Era of Good Feeling? Maybe for those in power. Literally, it does say that, right? It literally does say that right there. Anyway, in 1820, Monroe was reelected almost unanimously. Monroe was the third and final president who made up the Virginia dynasty, which included which were Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. The American System. In order to strengthen the national economy and further promote national unity, Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, the congressperson who runs the House of Representatives, proposed a program called the American System. This system consisted of three parts: a national bank, tariffs, and infrastructure. A bank of the United States would issue a single U.S. currency. The bank, whose original charter expired in 1811, received a new charter in 1816 and was called the Second Bank of the United States, but it was still controversial. The South opposed tariffs because they hurt its economy, and some people argue that the Constitution did not say that Congress could spend money on public works within the individual states. Protective tariffs would be increased to encourage American manufacturing. Britain had cut the colonies dependent on British manufactured goods because that was good for British businesses. But men like Henry Clay understood how important manufacturing was to the new country. Tariffs would give young companies a fair shot at growing. Money collected from taxes and tariffs would be spent building roads and canals, infrastructure. Congress had already approved the construction of the Cumberland Road from Cumberland, Maryland to Vandalia, Illinois, later called the National Road. Congress also invested in the Erie Canal, built almost entirely by hand between 1817 and 1825 to connect New York City with the Great Lakes region. The Erie Canal led to increased trade and a population surge in the Midwest. It inspired the building of many more canals in pre-railroad era America. So pretty much, this map pretty much shows what I just read. There are also some words down there, but I'm not going to read them. Actually, the idea of investing federal dollars in transportation was controversial, so the Erie Canal was largely the work of Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York. It was so successful that New York became known as the Empire State. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the first time many people in America needed a clock. On a farm, you could plan your day by the movement of the sun. In a factory, not so much. The American Revolution is said to have begun in Rhode Island in 1793 when Samuel Slater built the first American spinning mill, a factory that makes cloth. Rhode Island's geography was perfect for water-powered mills, and the War of 1812 made it tough to get imported goods, inspiring Americans to find more efficient ways to produce their own. The most famous factory was a textile mill started by Francis Cabot Lowell in 1814 that mostly employed young women. It was so successful that it led to the founding of an entire town called Lowell, Massachusetts. The Lowell girls were paid well, but they worked long hours in grueling conditions. The Industrial Revolution was a time of great innovation. New technology of the era included interchangeable parts. Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, introduced pre-manufactured identical musket parts for the Army. This created the possibility of mass production. The telegraph, invented by Samuel F. B. Morse in 1837, improved communication. Using Morse code, telegraphs sent short pulses of energy along a wire that were translated into letters that spelled out messages. If you want to know how those worked, my best bet would be to watch Balto, because there is a few scenes where a man uses that, and of course the dog being the running gag of that scene with how his body moves along with what the guy is doing. Really kind of funny stuff there. I highly recommend watching Balto if you haven't seen it. Really good movie, that one. Steam power. Once steam engines were improved by James Watt in 1780, factories no longer had to be located near rivers. The steamboat, perfected by Robert Fulton in 1807, improved river transportation. The steam locomotive, created by Peter Cooper in 1830, improved land transportation and led to the development of railroads. So let's think about this. You have a steamboat and a steam locomotive. Very interesting stuff to be invented during this time period, because it sure did help a lot of people in their own respective ways. New technology affects regions differently. New technology helped people who were headed west. They could now use better agricultural tools like the John Deere plow and the McCormick reaper. Wheat became a cash crop. Cities such as Chicago sprang up. Farms in the Midwest began to supply the factory workers in the Northeast with food, and the Northeast began to supply the Midwest with manufactured goods. Long distances seemed to become shorter thanks to American innovation. In the South, the most significant invention was the cotton gin. Invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, it could clean seeds from cotton quickly. Taking seeds out by hand was so labor intensive that it was not worth growing cotton. Now all that changed. The cotton gin also increased the use of enslaved people. When the Constitution was written, the South insisted that slavery be kept legal, but many Northerners believed that slavery would eventually die out, and even made a plan to phase out the international slave trade in 1808. The cotton gin ended the hope that slavery would quietly fade away. Sad but unfortunate but true. Plantation owners, who made up only about 3% of the southern population, generated huge profits. In the Deep South, cotton was king, and little attention was paid to either manufacturing or infrastructure. The North and South developed economic systems with very different needs. The development of the Erie Canal, roads, and later railroads actually meant that the Midwest was deeply connected to the eastern trading hubs. This made the Midwest the natural partner of the North rather than the South, adding a new layer to the regional divisions. Slavery and resistance intensifies. Cotton farming is very hard on the soil, so the cotton gin also led to westward expansion in the South. By 1808, the international slave trade had been abolished, but a terrible domestic slave trade that separated family members from one another developed. Enslavers even came to use the fear of sale as a weapon. An enslaved person who was considered uncooperative might be told that they would be sold downriver. That meant one thing: life on a cotton plantation where enslaved people were out in the field before the sun came up and not back in their quarters until the sun went down, and being watched all day by overseers with whips. By the early part of the century, almost every enslaved person in the U.S. had been born into slavery. As Southern wealth became even more dependent on enslaved labor, resistance to slavery grew. Enslaved people were determined to win their freedom. Nat Turner, one of the most famous enslaved rebels, led a violent uprising in 1831 in Virginia. Many Southern whites earned their living as yeomen, small-scale farmers who owned land but not enslaved people, or as tenant farmers, who rented their land. These people tended to be poor and were left unharmed in the uprising. Nat Turner's rebellion scared many Southerners and hardened their position. Nat Turner could read and write. He was deeply religious, read the Bible, and believed God had signaled him to rebel. Some states passed even harsher laws to control enslaved people, which included making it illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and forbidding gatherings of enslaved people. The rebellion also proved that enslaved people were not content to live enslaved, as Southerners often argued, and drew the attention, as Turner had hoped it would, of anti-slavery groups in the North. In the end, Turner was caught and hanged, as were approximately 150 other enslaved people. Sectionalism. The Industrial Revolution swept the economy and social structure of each region as they became specialized and distinct. This led to a rise in sectionalism, or loyalty to one specific region. As always, the Northeast focused on factories and trade, and the South relied on plantations. Now the West was a place for people to exploit newly colonized land. This created regional politics. The North advocated high tariffs so that people would buy American-made goods. The South supported slavery, and they also supported low tariffs because they imported most of their goods. Northerners wanted the government to sell its land at a high price to discourage poor workers from leaving the cities, but Westerners wanted the government to sell them land at a low price and give them roads and other public improvements. The Missouri Compromise. one of the few that would become the build up. This would be one of those two things that would lead to the slow build up to what would eventually happen. But again, we're not there yet. A conflict rooted in sectionalism happened when Missouri applied for statehood in 1817. At the time, the U.S. consisted of 11 slave states and 11 free states. If Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, as it wanted, it would upset a balance of power in the Senate between slave and free states. So, long story short, well, we'll show it to you guys here in a little bit because we got to talk about this a little bit more. In 1820, Henry Clay came up with a solution for the land from the Louisiana Purchase, the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise divided the land from the Louisiana Purchase into separate regions defined by slavery. It stipulated that Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, whereas Maine, which was still a part of Massachusetts, would enter at the same time as a free state. In all future applications for statehood, slavery would be illegal north of the southern border of Missouri at latitude 36 degrees 3630. Slavery was increasingly becoming an issue that divided the North and South. So the increased unity that emerged from the War of 1812 and the era of good feeling that followed did not last. Before we go in, that's the map of the United States in 1820. This is what it was. Relations with England and Spain. The U.S. and Britain agreed that neither nation would maintain a navy in the Great Lakes region or along the U.S.-Canada border. A demilitarized border between the U.S. and Canada was created at the 49th parallel, another word for a line of latitude, stretching as far west as the Rocky Mountains. Relations between the U.S. and Britain improved, but tensions with Spain were high. The U.S. claimed western Florida belonged to the U.S. because it was part of the Louisiana Purchase. Spain disagreed. As American settlers moved into the Florida Territory, the Seminole people, who were indigenous to the area, raided the settlers and helped enslaved people escape. In April 1818, without government permission, Andrew Jackson, already famous for his victory over the Creek warriors at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend during the War of 1812, invaded Spanish territory and captured two Spanish forts, starting the First Seminole War. Instead of punishing Jackson and knowing that Spain could not fight back, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, former President Adams' son, gave Spain two choices. They could control the Seminole living in Spanish Florida or sell the territory to the U.S. in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Spain sold Florida and their claims to part of the Pacific Northwest to the U.S. for $5 million. Don't mind any background noises that you hear. It's just family members. The Monroe Doctrine. Spain was losing territories not only in the U.S. but also throughout Latin America. The people living in the 13 British colonies that staged the American Revolution weren't the only ones in the Americas unhappy about being ruled by Europeans living across the Atlantic. Simon Bolivar led revolutions that freed people from Spanish rule in modern-day Bolivia, Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. Also it should be noted, doctrine, a theory or position on an issue. Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla won independence for Mexico in 1821. When France, Russia, Prussia, and Austria discussed helping Spain regain its land, President Monroe feared that European countries would also attempt to recolonize other territories claimed by the U.S. On December 2nd, 1823, Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine. It established American foreign policy for years to come and set the stage for America to become a world power. Its three major points were: 1. European interference in U.S. affairs would not be tolerated, and the U.S. would stay neutral in European colonies or conflicts. Jeez, that was a heck of a cough. That was from a family member in case you're wondering what that was. 2. The U.S. wouldn't tolerate new colonization in either North or South America. 3. Any attempt by Europe to further colonize the Americas would be considered an act of aggression. The election of 1824. All the candidates of the 1824 presidential election belonged to the Democratic Republican Party. The North was in favor of John Quincy Adams. The South supported Andrew Jackson or William Crawford, and the West wanted Henry Clay or Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote but didn't receive a majority of electoral votes. Popular vote method of electing a candidate based on a majority of votes, which is ironic because that's not how we elect our presidents. We do it by way of an electoral college, which has on 2 occasions caused a bit of controversy. More on those later, probably. Well, if we don't talk about it, I will talk about it myself. But that's not till much later. But this would be one of the few times where it was this would be this would be one of the other controversial elections, and you're about to find out why. Jackson got the most votes, about 40%, but not a majority. To put it simply, Jackson had 99 electoral votes, and he had 151,271 votes. John Quincy Adams was second with 84 electoral votes and 113,122 votes. Crawford was third with 41 electoral votes, having 40,856 votes. And Clay was last with 37 electoral votes, with 47,531 votes for him. No candidate won a majority of the Electoral College vote. There were too many candidates. This is probably why a two-party system is in place. But still, I gotta say, kind of being to the point to where people are not really caring about the two major parties at this point. Like, some people may like certain members of each party. Like in my case, while I am a center leftist, there have been some right wingers that I do support. With one of them being the late great John McCain, because I have heard so many great things about this man. I even remember being told by a family member that if it wasn't for his running mate, they would have voted for McCain over Obama. Not a bash on Obama, by the way. Not really. But it was just a matter of, well, he would have voted for McCain, but McCain made a very bad decision in his running mate, and that pushed him to go from McCain to Obama. I don't remember who the other options for McCain were at the time, because in 2008 uh, I was younger than 18, so I'm not going to go with my age on that one. Hold on a second. Sorry, if I remember was asking me about Sarah Palin. I said that's what I just said. But anyway, but yeah. Anyway, we're moving on. We are going way in advance. We're not like, dude. We're just into the 1824 election, and I'm talking about things that happened in the 2000s. Let's hold off on that until we get there. All right, all right. Moving on. Back to 1824 election. Back to the 1824 election. According to the Constitution, the House of Representatives would decide the winner in that situation. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, who finished in last place, persuaded his colleagues to vote for John Quincy Adams. When Adams became the country's sixth president and appointed Clay as the Secretary of State, his opponents argued that a backroom deal had been made. And that's why this was controversial, because people felt like with how with the younger Adams, the younger Adams became president, they felt like, wait a minute, this does not seem right here. Something's wrong here. What the heck? How the heck does this work? So we got two people. Because again, look at the votes here. John Quincy Adams was second in the electoral votes at 84, and he had 113,122 of the popular vote, whereas Clay had 37. So basically, second and fourth place became the president and vice president, respectively. And oh man, were the people who supported the other two, particularly Andrew Jackson, were not happy at all about that. To be quite perfectly honest, I cannot, regardless of how I feel about the other two people, I can understand why they and their supporters were pissed off. You know, I can honestly understand why. Yeah, I honestly can. Anyway, apparently John Quincy Adams' presidency was so uneventful because we're going from 1824 to the election of 1828 and Jacksonian democracy. The bitterness and anger over the 1824 election led to the development of two new political parties in a rematch of the previous election. The Democrats supported Jackson. The National Republicans supported Adams. Jackson was seen by many as a hard-working national war hero and had earned the nickname Old Hickory for his toughness. And that toilet flush pretty much signified how bad Jackson's presidency would probably be, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about it, but that's kind of ironic that I talk about this and the toilet flushers. Anyway, he won an overwhelming victory, and John C. Calhoun, who had been John Quincy Adams' vice president, became his vice president. Some people could probably see that as Calhoun being a bit of a quote-unquote turncoat, because he went from John Quincy Adams' vice president, Adams was a Republican, to to become Andrew Jackson's vice president, who was a Democrat. Anyway, one reason for Jackson's victory was that he promoted expanding Democratic privileges to a wider population. Called Jacksonian democracy, this movement included the extension of suffrage, the right to vote. Before, only white men who owned property or paid taxes could vote, but Jackson loosened these restrictions to include all white men over the age of 21. Jackson's win was considered a triumph for the common man. Well over half the population still had no right to vote. His vision for democracy did not extend the right to vote to either free or enslaved black Americans, indigenous peoples, or women of any class or race. In other words, it was all about the white man. 100% all about the white man at this point. Before it was white men that owned slaves. Now it's just white men. I honestly would wonder if the all the people that were in this country at that point, in each respective state, if they were given the right to vote, I wonder how differently things would have played out with these elections. That'd be an interesting question to ask ChatGPT about. That one channel that does that. I think that'd be an interesting question for that. You know what I'm saying? I honestly think that's an interesting question. But anyway, Jackson began to replace government bureaucrats with his friends and supporters. Called the spoils system, this was criticized as favoritism and political payback, which can be understandable here. But Jackson argued that it was good to clean house. So, on one hand, if you wanted to get rid of the government bureaucrats, okay, that could be supported. But when you do friends and supporters, that's not really a good thing to go about it. Honestly, you should just have people that are not part of the quote unquote government bureaucrats, which again, I'm pretty sure the common man would have what was probably a decision they supported. But when you just give it to people that you know and people that support you, not really a good combination. If you want my honest opinion, you should only give these positions to people who know what the they're doing. I don't even care who it is. As long as they know what they're doing and they literally have something to show that they know what they're talking about, so be it. Jackson appointed Martin Van Buren as Secretary of State and depended on his advice. He also relied on his kitchen cabinet, friends who gave him advice, often in the White House kitchen. Now I know why they call it the kitchen cabinet. Because, but I got several questions. Number one, why go to your friends? Why not go to your advisors, etc., etc.? Or are your friends the advisors? In which case, again, you should go after people that know what they're talking about, that would give you more, better advice than just friends who are just probably going to tell you what you want to hear. I say probably, because they might, but they might not. Also, why in the kitchen of all places? Seriously, why in the kitchen? That doesn't make any sense to me. Also, if you hear the TV going back, hopefully that doesn't cause any sort of copyright stuff going on there. But anyway, tariffs and the nullification crisis. In 1828, before Jackson took office, Congress passed a tariff that taxed raw materials and manufactured goods so much that the South called it the Tariff of Abominations. The South argued that the tariff was unconstitutional because it favored one region over another. Also, the states could nullify laws that were unconstitutional because of the theory of state sovereignty, which says that the power of the federal government comes from the states and that the states are more powerful. Alright. Also, I'm gonna probably shut my door if that gets too loud again. In the Nullification Act of 1832, South Carolina declared a federal tariff null and void and threatened to secede from the Union. Jackson had shown support for states' rights by vetoing a renewal of the charter for the Second Bank of the United States, so it surprised many people when he pushed for Congress to pass the Force Bill, which would allow him to use the Army to enforce the tariff. Sounding awfully familiar a little bit, doesn't it? Again, modern times with what Trump was doing earlier this year, but again, moving on. In 1833, Henry Clay came up with a plan that would gradually reduce the tariff. South Carolina agreed to the compromise. None of this resolved the debates about states' rights versus federal power, but historians argue that South Carolina's nullification of the tariff was a dress rehearsal for the fight the state thought was sure to come over the issue of slavery. In a twist of history, Abraham Lincoln later used Jackson's assertion of federal power over state power to justify the Civil War. How many people knew about that, I wonder? The Whig Party and the Panic of 1837. Partly in opposition to Jackson's destruction of the Second Bank of the United States, a new political party formed. The Whig Party was formed in opposition to what its members saw as a danger of majority parties. Led by Henry Clay, the Whig Party nominated 3 candidates for president in 1836 in hopes of throwing the election. They took their names from the English anti-monarchy party because they were opposed to choosing electors by popular vote. They thought it led to the tyranny of King Andrew Jackson. However, so that's interesting that Trump isn't the only person being accused of acting like a king. I honestly didn't, when I first read this, I honestly forgot from my first reading of this, which has been some time ago, that they called him King Andrew. However, Van Buren, the presidential nominee for Jackson's supporters, now called the Democrats, still won and took office in 1837 as the eighth president. By then, the economic boom of the 1830s was over, partly as a result of Jackson's closure of the National Bank. Hmm, who did not see that coming? During the Panic of 1837, the values of land, cotton, and paper money decreased, leading to terrible inflation. So, in a way, Jackson put Van Buren in a very, very bad position. Good job, Andrew Jackson. Hmm. Van Buren, not Jackson, was blamed for the depression that followed, even though it was because of Jackson. This is what I gotta say. I gotta say this. I always love it how people will blame the person currently in office for something that literally the previous president at least like put in a law, but it would not come into effect until the next president. I always love it when presidents do that because to me it's like just in case I don't win re-election or because I know I'm not going to win re-election, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to make sure it takes effect during the next guy's term instead of my own, because then it's going to make me look more bad than I already am. And let's not forget, honestly, I have always been under the belief that generally, it doesn't happen all the time, but generally, second terms are worse than the first. Goodness knows how many presidents have fallen victim to that sentiment. And you guys will probably see where I'm coming from as we go along with the history. I mean, think about it. Because Andrew Jackson had 1828, so he was in office in 1829. Um, so, so he had two terms, and in his second term, he dismantled. His second term, I think, first or second term, in either term, one of the two terms he dismantled the Bank of the United States, the Second Bank of the United States, and that has caused to where at the end of his presidency, it caused, as I just said, the Panic of 1837. And so, because Van Buren was in office, people blamed him over Jackson. In my book, we should stop blaming the guy in office if we know he wasn't the one that started it. If we know the previous guy made it into law, but made it to where it would take effect some years down the line, and it happened in that particular year under a different person, we should be blaming the previous guy. Because they were the reason why this is happening under the current guy. And I believe that with any president, past, present, and future. I think we should stop blaming the current guy, the guy that it happened under, and blame it on the guy that pretty much started it happening. That caused it to happen, I should say. But you know what I mean. Anyway. But anyway, Van Buren, not Jackson, was blamed for the depression that followed, particularly because he believed in laissez-faire economic policies. Tippecanoe and Tyler 2. Rolls right off the tongue, and what a tongue twister. That's a tongue twister right there, for real though. Tippecanoe and Tyler 2. Anyway, in 1840, the Whig Party nominated William Henry Harrison for president and John Tyler for vice president. Using a log cabin as their symbol, the Whig Party tried to show that Harrison was a common man from the Ohio frontier, whereas Van Buren was a man of privilege. But Harrison also came from a rich family, so yeah. In other words, the Whig Party were hypocritical with what they were doing. Anyway, these personal attacks on Van Buren are called the Log Cabin Campaign. The Whigs also used the catchy slogan "Tippecanoe and Tyler too" to remind people that, like Jackson, Harrison was a decorated military campaigner, and of his connection to the Battle of Tippecanoe. The Whigs' plan worked, and William Henry Harrison was elected the ninth president. On Inauguration Day, which was bitterly cold, Harrison, who was 68 years old, didn't wear a coat while he delivered his speech. He caught pneumonia and died about a month later. Tyler became president and went back to the beliefs of his former party, the Democratic Party. Like the other parties, the Whig Party was destined to fall victim to sectional differences. Also, it should be duly noted that actually it's been told in recent times that what is said here may not have actually been the case. It may have been due to what was it? Pretty much garbage in some way. I think it was how the garbage excuse me. I think it was like how the people's garbage was like going down the river or something, and that just was so bad that it affected him. In some way, I forget how it go. I'm pretty sure that's how it went. Could be wrong or like not entirely accurate, but yeah. Anyway, so we had two things here. First off, longest in our so two historical things here. Number one, Harrison's inaugural address was the longest in history. And two, first time a president died in office and was succeeded by his vice president. Also shortest presidency. I don't think you can get any. I don't think unless otherwise unless we vote for a man that is, and I'm not outside of Trump and Biden before him. If we voted for a man that was pretty old and he died less than a month in office, that would be a shocker. Because, like, that's something you wouldn't expect to happen in your lifetime. Like, you hear about it in history, but you don't think it would actually happen in real life. But as life has shown, anything could literally happen at any moment in time. Chapter 17 Westward Migration Again. As canals, railroads, and roads were built westward, travel became easier, and Americans moved west looking for new opportunities. But the land that migrants were after was already occupied by peoples who had lived there for centuries. A pattern was created. White settlers entered an area, pushing the local population west. If the indigenous population chose to stay put, settlers used forced assimilation to take on the cultural habits of a larger group, violated treaties, or engaged in warfare and outright military removal. If one strategy failed, the settlers simply tried another one. The Indian Removal Act. Thomas Jefferson hoped that indigenous peoples would accept white ways and become his version of American. I'm just going to be honest and say that's a dumbass thought. That's literally the dumbest thing you could ever think. Like, really, dude? You thought indigenous people would accept white ways and become your version of American, whatever that version was for him. Which, I'm sorry, but no. That was never going to happen. At all. Because you're talking about people who are looking at American settlers at the American population at this point as people who are taking their lands, which they were. And you think they're gonna want to take part in your version of America? I'm sorry, but that was never gonna freaking happen. At all. Jeez. That's just crazy, man. In the Southeast, the Cherokee Nation thought this sort of assimilation was the best chance to live side by side with white Americans. But again, didn't really go down that way because, again, at some point, um, the indigenous people would fight back against the American people. But anyway, the Cherokee Nation had developed a written language and had a constitution of their own as well as newspapers. They had been farmers for centuries, but adopted the use of white American tools and techniques, and in some cases kept enslaved people. Intermarriage was not uncommon. So in a way it helped, but at the same time, the American people didn't really give two shits, to be honest. Even if what, um, what, even with this happening, it's still, the American people just still did not give a damn. The Cherokees of Georgia were the most assimilated of the Southeast tribes, but the state of Georgia had motivation to displace them, or to force people to leave their home or country. I gotta say, that's kind of happening right now again. I'm sorry, but every time I hear about these, it's making me think about some of the things that are happening right now in today's America. I know that's going to piss a number of people off, but this is how I'm seeing it. In 1828, gold had been found on their land. Georgia began to pass laws that helped the settlers take over Cherokee lands. The Cherokees were part of a separate nation recognized in an 18th century treaty, and they had a deep understanding of American law. They took their case to the Supreme Court. Now, if you guys had to get... Now, this is a rhetorical question. How do you think... history... Hello, JT, how you doing tonight? Yep, history repeats itself. It always does. That's why there's the old saying. Those who fail to learn history are doomed to repeat it, and those who learn about history are doomed to put up with people who don't learn it, or something to that effect. And that's why I read this book, so that way people can learn history and they got no excuse not to learn it. But if you guys had a guess, how do you think the Supreme Court case went? It was Worcester v. Georgia. Let's see how it went. I'm not even gonna bash either party. I'm gonna see how this goes. Let's see how this goes down. In 1832, in the case of Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokees were a sovereign nation, and that only the federal government, not Georgia, had the power to form a treaty with another sovereign nation. Since both the state of Georgia and President Jackson decided to ignore the ruling. Some people are thinking about what I'm thinking about here as I read that. Because, didn't we, regardless of where you stand on it, didn't we just have a Supreme Court ruling that happened to be very rarely unanimous, where the Supreme Court told Trump he had to do something, and Trump is like, how about no? Didn't we just have that happen? Yes, we freaking did. Again, regardless of where you stand on it, you can't deny that happened. Nobody on either side can deny that did not happen. No, it did not. No, it did not. They cannot say that. No. And if they did, you might want to look it up, because Yes, the Supreme Court did rule in unanimously, very shockingly unanimously, I might add, um, that what Trump was doing was not good, and they told him, "You need to bring this person that you tried to, that you did the, that you deported. You got to bring him back." And Trump's like, "No, I don't think I'm gonna do that. No, I'm good. I'm good. You, yeah, I swear to God, now that I'm reading about this, I swear Jackson and Trump have too many things in common. I'm telling you, it's crazy. But the Supreme Court had no, and what's even worse, the Supreme Court had no power to enforce it. That seems to be the problem sometimes. Like when the Supreme Court knows what they're doing is right, um, like when they know, you know when they're in the right, when a good amount of it, when just about like when something is ruled but it's not along party lines. Yeah, you know it's most likely a good thing. However, here in recent times, and I'm going to be 100% honest, I'm going to be a little bit political here, but I'm going to be honest. I honestly believe, and actually, I actually have this book over here that I read last year to celebrate 4th of July. But I'm going to use this book real quick here because of this. See, you see this? You see this part right here? I feel like at this point in time, uh, while it may not happen every time, and I'm not going to act like it does happen every time, but to me, it happens a good amount of times that it's not even funny. In my honest opinion, Trump and the Supreme Court are throwing this out of the fucking window. And I know that's going to sound controversial to some people, but that's how I feel about it. That's how I'm feeling right now. One, I can honestly talk more about it because I'm honestly thinking about doing a very late 2025 reading of the Constitution because I feel like people need to hear it again. That and the Declaration of Independence. I did it last year, and I asked a question that was involving the situation from the Supreme Court that happened last year, and so on and so forth. Mirrored, but we know what you mean. Well, yeah, I know it was mirrored, but again, as long as you know what I'm saying, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, just as long as you know I'm talking about the Constitution and that he's throwing it out the window, even if some people may not agree with my idea, with my opinion, um, at least you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, but excuse me with that. Part that just may or may not have been picked up. But anyway, meanwhile, at the urging of President Jackson, Congress had passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the federal government to force the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee or Creek, and Seminole who lived on valuable farmland off their land. These nations had assimilated into American culture to varying degrees with their hopes that doing so might protect their sovereignty over their land. The plan was to send them to the Great Plains, which Congress mistakenly believed was barren, worthless desert. So, on one hand, they're forcing a massive group of people off their land, but they're also sending them into land that they could still use because Congress, the people, the Congress were a bunch of idiots. Okay, moving on. Congress selected an area of modern-day Oklahoma to be Indian Territory, also known as a reservation. Within the next few years, Congress also established the Bureau of Indian Affairs to manage the removal and transport of indigenous peoples. Guess where this leads to? I'm about to read the title, and if you said it or thought it, you know what it is. The Trail of Tears. The policy of removing indigenous people to what is now Oklahoma lasted from 1830 to 1850 and involved the forced displacement of 60,000 people. The Muskogee Creek had never recovered from their defeats in the War of 1812, and internal conflict made it easy to force them out of Georgia. The Choctaw Nation split, with half the nation moving to Oklahoma, while the other half remained in the South and faced hostile laws and constant harassment. The Chickasaws sold their lands to the federal government. Once in Oklahoma, they merged with the Choctaw. The Cherokee continued to resist. Ignoring the Supreme Court, the federal government had one more trick to try. In 1835, Congress was able to persuade a very small number of Cherokees to sign a treaty ceding their land. The government disregarded the law and decided to view the treaty as an agreement with the entire tribe. Gee, I wonder how bad that is. Gee, I wonder how, what's the word I'm looking for? Corrupt that is. Huh. President Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott and thousands of U.S. Army troops to invade the Cherokee Nation in 1838. 16,000 Cherokees were moved into holding camps and then forced to go to their new land. During their 800-mile trek to Indian Territory, a quarter of the population died from disease, starvation, poor weather conditions, and harsh treatment. Their painful march became known as the Trail of Tears. So, this will be a recurring theme in American history, by the way. But we'll get to those moments when we get to those. Seminole resistance to the Indian Removal Act. In Florida, the Seminoles also resisted being displaced. Although they were forced to sign removal treaties too, their chief, Osceola, urged his people to go to war against the Americans, starting the Second Seminole War. Even after Osceola was captured in 1837, his people hid in the Everglades, continued to aid runaway enslaved people, made surprise attacks, and used guerrilla tactics against the Americans. In 1842, the U.S. Army gave up after spending $500 million in today's money on the war. About $500 million. How much is that? Someone look this up. In today's money, how much would $500 million be in 1842? Americans did it for the better of the country. That's what we always say, to be honest. Regardless of how true or bullcrap it is, we tend to say that a lot. I'm being honest. This is how it feels. Like we just use, like it may have been the truth in some cases, but I feel like we use that so much that it really might sound like an excuse to other people to justify what we're doing, regardless if it is justifiable or not. Oregon country. Back in Europe, hats made from beaver fur became a popular fashion accessory, prompting an explosion of the American beaver fur trade. It became so large that it nearly wiped out the eastern beaver population. Jeez. People who made their living from beavers traveled to the northwest to find more. A lot of these mountain men immersed themselves in indigenous culture and married into indigenous families, choosing to live in the northwest. As the beaver population in the northwest also died out, and as beaver hats grew less fashionable, some mountain men started farming in Oregon, but many went back east and became guides to help other people make the journey west. The land the mountain men settled in was called Oregon Country, modern-day Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, along with parts of Montana and Wyoming. The land had been claimed by the U.S., Britain, Spain, and Russia, but the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty added flooded the U.S. and defined Spanish-American borders. It also recognized the 42nd parallel as the southern border of the Oregon Territory, and another treaty between Russia and the U.S. in 1824 kept Spain and Russia out. The U.S. and Britain still both wanted the territory, but they decided not to go to war over it, instead choosing to control it jointly. I find it kind of funny how they remember one treaty, but not the other treaty that was between Russia and the U.S. in 1824. Makes you wonder about that, you know. The Oregon Trail. After the Panic of 1837 and at the height of the economic depression, many Americans chose to make the 2,000-mile trip from Independence, Missouri to Oregon on the Oregon Trail. I actually have a book that takes place. It's a fictionalized story that takes place during the Oregon Trail, but yeah, I do have that, and I will be reading that at some point. The difficult journey generally took 6 months in a wagon train of prairie schooners, wagons that looked like ships from a distance. And yes, a schooner is a kind of sailboat, for those wondering what that is. Missionaries, someone who goes on a mission to a foreign place to spread their religion, were among the first to travel the Oregon Trail. Their reports of the beautiful land of the West encouraged others to follow. It was widely believed that American expansion to the Pacific coast was part of manifest destiny. The idea that the U.S. was chosen by God to spread across the continent, and that the expansion of the United States was the people's manifest or obvious destiny. 18.5 billion today. It's crazy. The Santa Fe Trail. The Santa Fe Trail. The Santa Fe Trail also began in Independence, Missouri, and led to Santa Fe. After Mexico gained its independence and took control of New Mexico province, which stretched from California to Texas, this area became an ideal place for trade. Although the 800-mile trip was long and often dangerous, the prospect of large profits inspired many traders. The Mormon Trail. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had been founded by Joseph Smith in 1830 in New York. The church's members, also called Mormons, were persecuted because they practiced polygamy, having more than one spouse, and communal ownership of property, among other reasons. The Mormons moved to the Midwest, to Nauvoo, Illinois, but conditions there were equally difficult and dangerous. Smith was murdered by an anti-Mormon mob in 1844. The new Mormon leader, Brigham Young, led his people in 1846 to an area they called Deseret. When Deseret became the Utah Territory in 1850, Brigham Young was appointed governor. Utah didn't become a state until 1896, nearly 50 years later. And here's a picture of all the trails. You have the Mormon Trail, which, like I said, was from Illinois to Utah Territory. You have the Oregon Trail, which was from Missouri to Oregon. The Santa Fe Trail, which went from the same place where, the Oregon Trail happened, and it went down to here. And then you have the one that they didn't really talk about, called the Old Spanish Trail. And they went from here. Well, they went from here, then they split up to here, and they went over to the southern part of California. So, surprisingly, we don't talk about this Old Spanish Trail, but they do show that, but alright. Chapter 18. The Lone Star Non-State. After Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, it became a republic, a form of government in which a state is ruled by representatives of its citizens, with a government based in Mexico City. Its territory included present-day Texas, which the Spanish called Tejos. Spain had tried to attract families to the land but settled for building about 2 dozen missions. Their goals? To convert indigenous peoples to Christianity and cultivate their loyalty to Spain that way. The local population of I hate mispronouncing things. The local population of Huaticans and Chamanos were unenthusiastic but did accept help defending themselves against the Apaches and Comanches who had only recently moved into the region. Settlers in Texas. At the beginning of the 19th century, very few people lived in Texas aside from a few thousand Tejanos, or Spanish Texans. While Tejanos were leaving, the Indian, or actually Tejanos, right? So why am I saying Tejanos? It would really be, Tejon, yeah, I think it would be Tejanos. So yeah, we'll say it like that. At the beginning of the 19th century, very few people lived in Texas, aside from a few thousand Tejanos, or Spanish Texans. While Tejanos were leaving, the Indian population was growing because of displacement. Caddos, Cherokees, Alabamas, and Coushatas moved west into the area. To promote growth, the newly independent Mexican nation offered large, inexpensive land grants to empresarios, people who agreed to find settlers to purchase these grants. One of those settlers, Stephen F. Austin, also received permission to start a new colony on the condition that the new settlers follow Mexican law. Austin agreed, and after arriving in Texas in 1821, he recruited 300 new families, who became known as the Old 300, to settle in the area. These families encouraged many more Americans to move to Texas in the coming years. How well do you think that's going to turn out? Migration to Texas led to the first text messaging, GIT, carved into a cabin door meant gone to Texas. And you want to know how well it turned out? Well, the new American settlers broke 3 Mexican laws immediately. They did not speak Spanish or practice Catholicism, and they brought enslaved people into the territory. Within a decade, there were 20,000 Americans in Texas, 5,000 enslaved people, and only 600 Tejanos. And the U.S. decided to pressure the Mexican government to sell its land. In 1830, fearful of the growing dissatisfied American population in Texas, the Mexican government outlawed immigration from the U.S. to Texas and began to enforce their anti-slavery laws. And you know as well as I do how well that went. The Texas War for Independence. American Texans grew increasingly unhappy about following Mexican law and drafted a constitution for Texas as an independent state of Mexico. In 1833, Stephen Austin met with Mexico's vice president to urge Mexico to lift the ban on immigration and to discuss the independent state idea. Instead, Mexico's new president, Antonio López de Santa Anna, took this as proof of Austin's support for rebellion. He arrested Austin in Saltillo and jailed him in Mexico City. Santa Anna, who had angered Mexicans as well by seizing power, also declared himself a dictator, thereby violating and subsequently abolishing Mexico's constitution, which protected the Tejanos' rights. By the time Austin was released 8 months later, even he, typically so diplomatic, agreed it was time for independence. In 1831, the Mexican government had lent a cannon to the small Texas settlement of Gonzales to help its inhabitants protect themselves from Comanche raids. In 1835, Santa Anna gathered troops and sent them to Gonzales with orders to seize this cannon. The Mexicans failed to retrieve the weapon, but the attempt set off the first battle in the Texas War for Independence. The Alamo. Having no army of their own, the Texans put out a call for volunteers. The 180-person volunteer militia, including free black people, rebel Tejanos, local residents, and adventure-seeking Americans like Davy Crockett and James Bowie, have occupied an abandoned mission called the Alamo from February 23rd to March 6, 1836. The volunteers were no match for Santa Anna, who had the entire Mexican military at his disposal. Mexican cannons broke down the walls of the Alamo, but the Texans did not surrender. After killing every soldier at the Alamo, the Mexicans captured and executed the remaining militia, who were stationed at a fort called Goliad in the Goliad Massacre. But rather than become discouraged by these events, more Texans were inspired to join the militia. The Battle of San Jacinto. As Santa Anna remained on the attack, the Texas militia, now more than double in size and led by Sam Houston, headed eastward. On April 21st, 1836, Houston's troops ambushed Santa Anna's army at their camp near the San Jacinto River. Ambush, for those wondering, ambush is to attack unexpectedly. Shouting, "Remember the Alamo," the Texans quickly defeated the Mexicans, taking Santa Anna captive and forcing him to sign a treaty recognizing Texan independence. The Lone Star Republic. During the siege of the Alamo, Texan leaders met to draft their own constitution, which they modeled on the U.S. Constitution. On March 2nd, 1836, they declared their independence and established the Republic of Texas, or the Lone Star Republic. After Santa Anna signed the treaty, elections were held and Sam Houston became president. Stephen Austin, whom the capital of Texas was later named for, became Secretary of State. Because the Republic of Texas was in debt and still in conflict with Mexicans, Houston requested that the U.S. annex Texas in 1836 so it could apply for statehood. Annex is to attach or add on. At the time, Jackson was president of the U.S., and he feared admitting another slave state to the Union, as well as provoking Mexico, so he denied the request. Instead, he offered Texas diplomatic recognition as its own nation. The next president, Martin Van Buren, inherited the Texas issue from Jackson. Annexation debates took place under the Van Buren administration. Mexico never recognized the new nation, forcing Texas to create the Texas Rangers, a militia devoted to guarding the border. Texas would not be admitted to the Union until 1845. Chapter 19. The Mexican-American War. Even after Congress approved the U.S. annexation of the Lone Star Republic in 1845, Texas remained a disputed territory. A new Mexican government declared that the treaty Santa Anna had signed was not valid, and Texas still belonged to Mexico. Oregon Country and California also remained in question. 54-40 or fight. When John Tyler fell out of favor with the Whig Party, the Whigs nominated Henry Clay as their candidate in the 1844 presidential election. The Democrats nominated James K. Polk, whose main campaign promise was in the slogan of 54-40 or fight. That is, he supported moving the northern border of Oregon Country, which the U.S. jointly occupied with Great Britain, at latitude 54-40 north, giving the U.S. more land. On this promise and the popularity of Manifest Destiny, Polk was elected president. Because he was more interested in territory than war, Polk eventually compromised with Britain to extend the border to the 49th parallel, which previous U.S. administrations had already proposed. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 reset the borders between the U.S. and British-controlled Canada, creating the Oregon Territory. U.S.-Mexico tensions. Mexico eventually acknowledged that Texas was an American territory, but the border between the two nations was not yet settled. The U.S. government considered the Mexican border to be along the Rio Grande River. The Mexican government believed the border was much farther north, along the Nueces River. The Mexican-American War begins. In 1845, President Polk sent Ambassador John Slidell to offer Mexico $30 million for the disputed areas of Texas, California, and New Mexico, but Mexico refused to negotiate. In a controversial move, Polk also sent General Zachary Taylor and his troops to Texas with instructions to make camp in the disputed region between the Rio Grande and the Nueces. Polk's stance was that this land was American land, so the U.S. was not invading Mexico. Mexico argued that the U.S. Army was making hostile moves. When Mexican troops engaged Taylor's men on April 25, 1846, Polk informed Congress that Mexico had attacked U.S. troops on U.S. soil without being provoked. In early May, Congress declared the Mexican-American War. Public support for war with Mexico was mixed. Gaining another southern territory would create more slave states in the Union. Still, the vote in Congress was a landslide since it would gain a lot of land at a very low cost. And because the book literally points this out, the Mexican-American War would be the second declared war under the Constitution. Abraham Lincoln, a first-term representative from Illinois, thought Polk had deliberately provoked Mexico. In the first speech he ever made in Congress, Lincoln demanded that Polk identify the exact spot on which Polk claimed that American blood had been spilled on American soil. Many Americans called the war Polk's War. Support for the war. Mexico had taken control of California from Spain after Mexico's war for independence. The Mexican government replaced the Spanish mission system with ranchos, or ranches, large parcels of land owned by wealthy rancheros and managed by vaqueros, or cowboys. Given the distance between California and Mexico, the Mexican Californians, called Californios, felt a stronger sense of local identity than of national identity. Like Tejanos before them, Californians felt little loyalty to Mexico, and there was a growing American population in the region. The white settlers in California, or Anglos, took this to an extreme. They didn't think California should be part of Mexico at all. In June 1846, a small group of Anglos in California decided to declare independence and proclaimed themselves the Republic of California. Because of the bear motif on the flag they flew, California briefly became known as the Bear Flag Republic. Immigrants also signed up to fight for the United States. By this time, immigration from Europe was rising. However, many Catholic immigrants from Germany, Canada, France, and Ireland, disgusted by the treatment of Catholic churches at the hands of the American military, deserted the U.S. Army and joined the Mexican Army. Because of the large number of Irish in this group, they became known as the St. Patrick's Battalion. These men faced severe punishment if caught deserting. More than 50 members of the battalion were executed by the U.S. military. So the question would be, would you consider this group of people as another group of traitors to this country? If that is the case, Mexico defeated. Despite political and physical resistance, the war went well for Polk. President Polk's plan for the Mexican-American War was to push the Mexican army out of Texas, take New Mexico and California, and then march on Mexico City. By the beginning of 1847, Zachary Taylor had invaded Mexico by crossing the Rio Grande River in the Rio Grande, and capturing the city of Monterrey. Meanwhile, General Stephen Kearny had taken control of New Mexico without firing a single shot and continued on to California, where there was also little resistance. By September 1847, General Winfield Scott and his troops captured Mexico City. Mexico surrendered, and the war was won. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Mexican-American War ended in 1848 when Mexico and the U.S. signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico gave up present-day California, Nevada, and Utah, along with parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming, a region referred to as the Mexican Cession, something that is ceded or given up. Mexico also recognized the U.S. annexation of Texas and agreed to set the border between Texas and Mexico at the Rio Grande. In exchange, America gave Mexico $15 million and granted land rights and protection to Mexicans and indigenous people who would now be living in the U.S. In 1853, Mexico also sold the U.S. a strip of land in present-day Arizona and New Mexico for $10 million. Negotiated by Ambassador James Gadsden, the Gadsden Purchase sent the border between the two nations. Settling the Southwest. After the U.S. took control of the Southwest, more Americans flocked there. Many followed the California Trail, an offshoot of the Oregon Trail that ran through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Although the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo granted land rights to the Mexicans and indigenous peoples who already inhabited land in the Southwest, these grants were generally not enforced by the U.S. government. Again, I wonder why. Over time, Mexican, indigenous, and Anglo cultures mixed, forming the distinct heritage of the American Southwest. Also, before I read this next part, here is a picture of the Gadsden Purchase being shown here. And that would become what would lead to the modern-day U.S.-Mexican border. The U.S. and Mexico border. But now to this green part here. Maybe the most famous travelers on the California Trail were the Donner Party, a group that set out for California, tried to find a shortcut, and then became stranded in the Sierra Nevada mountains during the winter of 1846 to 1847. Why are they famous? Well, when they ran out of food, some of them resorted to the only nourishment they could find. They ate each other. Gold Rush. One of the first American men to settle in California was John Sutter, who found Sutter's Fort in 1839. His homestead became a popular stop for people traveling or trading in the area near the Sacramento River, so he hired James Marshall, a carpenter, to build a sawmill. While he was working in January 1848, Marshall discovered gold. It wasn't long before the entire country learned that there was gold in the rivers and mountains of California. In 1848, tens of thousands of people from the U.S. and all over the world flooded into California to try to strike it rich. Because most of the miners arrived that year, they became known as 49ers. The miners usually agreed that the first person to begin looking for gold in a certain area could stake a claim to it, but conflicts often arose over mining rights. And although some people did get very wealthy, most miners ended up finding little or nothing of value. Boomtown life. The sudden influx of people in California led to the creation of mining camps. These camps quickly became boomtowns, cities that came to life almost overnight. Few women lived in the towns, but those who did could earn money running businesses. For example, some women ran restaurants or boarding houses. Merchants also prospered in the mining towns where there was little competition for their goods and services. One of the most famous and successful boomtown merchants was Levi Strauss, a Jewish German immigrant who sold miners sturdy work pants called Levi's. As gold supplies began to decline, the incorrect perception developed that Chinese miners were taking American gold. In 1852, the foreign miners' tax made mining too expensive for many Chinese immigrants. We have an act of going after people just because of things that may or may not have happened that they may or may not have been involved in. We have a knack for that. Instead of paying the tax, many Chinese miners decided to find other work. Some founded successful businesses, and these became the foundations of thriving Chinese communities throughout California. California statehood. Even after the gold rush died down, many miners remained to farm or ranch. After just 2 years as a territory, California had a large enough population to apply for statehood. California wasn't granted statehood immediately because it would be a free state. California would be California would upset the Union's 30-year-long balance. It would also mean that the South would lose some of its power in Congress. In 1850, in another compromise between Northern and Southern interests, California became the 31st state to be admitted to the Union, but tensions between the North and South mounted. I believe this is the last chapter. Yes, it is. Yep, this is indeed the last chapter. Let's see if we can get this done in under that 2 hour mark, and we are about 8.5 minutes away from that. So let's start it. Chapter 20: The Age of Reform. As the physical shape of the U.S. changed, so did its people and culture. Influenced in part by the Industrial Revolution, more immigrants poured into the country. Those already here began movements to secure more rights. Immigration. Millions of people immigrated to America in the mid-1800s. They often traveled in steerage, the lowest class on a ship which usually had bad conditions, but they made the journey in spite of the rough conditions. Many Irish people crossed the Atlantic because of the Irish potato famine and to escape anti-Catholic persecution from the Protestants in Great Britain, who colonized the small country. Mostly poor and uneducated, they settled in northeastern cities to work as industrial and domestic laborers. Driven out by an 1848 revolution in their homeland and general poverty, Germans made up another significant percentage of U.S. immigrants in the mid-19th century. Germans tended to settle in the Midwest, where they found inexpensive land and the opportunity to farm. Most large groups of immigrants settled in clusters. Scandinavians tended to head for the northern Midwest, and Chinese people who immigrated across the Pacific went to California. Nativism. Many Americans were afraid the new arrivals would take their jobs for lower pay. Those who opposed immigration became known as nativists, and nativist politics soared in popularity. I also gotta say, I love people that do this, where they're like, well, look at all these people taking our jobs, and it's like, how are they your jobs? Did you get that job? Or did they get it? Oh, they got it? Then it's their job, not yours. Shush your lip. I don't want to freaking hear it. Don't be like those people on South Park. You know, they took their jobs! You know, that South Park meme, that South Park, running gag, which was kind of funny for the amount of time that, which I would agree is really funny because of how they act like that. It's really funny to me, honestly. In 1849, a secret society of nativists founded the American Party. Then they were often called the Know Nothing Party because they refused to speak about the details of their organization. The Know Nothings were anti-Catholic and supported longer waiting periods for naturalization and a ban on foreign-born people holding public office. Within a few years, however, the party fell apart over disagreements about slavery, because again, slavery was a major issue at the time. Also, naturalization, when a foreigner becomes a citizen. City life. City life proved challenging for many immigrants. Most cities lacked adequate sewer systems, police and fire departments, and enough housing for a population boom. Immigrants tended to live in crowded tenement apartment buildings where disease spread easily. Others, however, prospered as middle-class business owners. Tenement, a low-rent, low-quality apartment. In other words, if you go there, you were basically not in a good building at all. The Second Great Awakening, but then again, you also you didn't have much of a choice but to go into those type of buildings. So, yeah. Getting back to what I was reading before I said that. The Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a new religious revival movement in the early 19th century with millions of supporters like the Great Awakening. Preachers in the movement challenged traditional Protestant views, encouraged an emotional attachment to religion, emphasized the power of each person rather than churches, priests, and rules to control their own soul and salvation, taught personal responsibility, wanted to improve the world. Reform movements. The Second Great Awakening's principles quickly spread outside religion. Many Americans, particularly middle-class women who had time and money to spare, developed a spirit of reform. The popularity of reform movements was so great that the 1820s to 1860s became known as the Age of Reform. Major reform movements of this time were the temperance movement. This blamed society's problems on liquor and wanted a ban on alcohol. The prison reform movement. This was led by Dorothea Dix, who encouraged the creation of mental institutions so that the ill wouldn't be imprisoned with criminals anymore. The juvenile justice system also began in the same time period. Education reform. This included creation of the first teachers' training schools. Catherine Beecher's first all-girls school, Samuel Gridley Howe's School for the Blind, Thomas Culloden's School for the Deaf, the expansion of public education, and the founding of liberal arts colleges, including Oberlin, the first college to admit women and black people. So, two things. The training schools were called normal schools, and Samuel Gridley Howe's School for the Blind. Helen Keller went there. Utopian societies. These were attempts to create perfect communities based on religious or philosophical ideals. The Shakers, whose faith-based society prohibited marriage and having children, lasted longer than you'd expect, though through the converts and the adoption of orphans. Utopia meaning a perfect place. Workers' rights movements. These included the establishment of a union for the Lowell textile mill workers that advocated for better working conditions and shorter workdays using strikes. The fear of unemployment in the Panic of 1837 stalled this movement. People wanted to keep any job they could get. Abolitionism. One of the most significant reform movements of the 1830s was the anti-slavery movement. They called themselves abolitionists because their goal was to abolish slavery, or to do away with slavery. They were a small but growing group of black and white people taking on the pro-slavery South. They considered many ways to end the institution of slavery. One short-lived idea was to send people back to Africa. In 1821, the American Colonization Society founded the African nation of Liberia as a free home for black people. As it turned out, it wasn't feasible to send large numbers of people to Liberia. Though some black people thought their rights in the U.S. would never be upheld and chose to return to Africa, most had lived their whole lives in the U.S. and wanted to stay. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison of Massachusetts began to publish The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper. He also founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. He advocated for an immediate freeing of all enslaved men and women with no payment to enslavers. This contradicted the British abolitionist plan that was put into place in 1833, which was gradual and paid compensation to enslavers. Abolitionists also included writer Henry David Thoreau, who refused to pay taxes for 6 years because those taxes would be used to support the Mexican-American War, which to him was all about spreading slavery. People who preferred novels to newspapers could read Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which detailed the horrors of enslavement. Now the fun begins, because I'm curious if I should read that book for historical context. For historical reasons, just because why not? Because I got so many books from back here that are from like the early 1900s. I am not kidding either. Like the early 1900s, stuff for sure. In addition to written materials, abolitionists traveled the North giving lectures. The Southern-born sisters Angelina and Sarah Brimke shared their personal accounts of growing up in the South and stirred their audiences to action. Former enslaved people such as Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth drew the most attention as they traveled the nation and the world, educating people about their enslaved lives. Frederick Douglass wrote the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, and delivered one of the most important anti-slavery orations on July 5th, 1852, which became known as What to the Slave is the 4th of July. I might also read that book as well, because I remember reading that book for a bit, but I never finished it. So I might read that as well. The Underground Railroad. In the mid-1800s, a network of abolitionists, free black people, and formerly enslaved people organized to help thousands of enslaved people escape to the North or to Canada. The Underground Railroad, not an actual railroad. I mean, if it was an actual railroad, they would not have gotten far doing that, doing what they did. But anyway, the Underground Railroad, not an actual railroad, organized transportation and hiding places for fugitives from slavery. Its most famous guide or conductor was Harriet Tubman, a formerly enslaved person who made more than a dozen trips to guide enslaved people to freedom. Fugitive, a person fleeing from intolerable circumstances. A runaway. Opposition to abolitionism. The South was one of the 5 richest economies in the world by this time, and abolitionism was a threat to Southerners' way of life. Even in the North, some people worried that free black people would take jobs from white people. In addition, most Northerners didn't know enough about slavery to care about ending it. That is why abolitionists worked so hard to educate Americans about it, and why Southerners worked so hard to shut them up. Abolitionists faced physical violence and political persecution. Abolitionism was illegal in the South, and while President Jackson was in office, he banned the U.S. Postal Service from delivering abolitionist materials. In 1833, a white man was whipped in Nashville for having abolitionist literature with him. In 1836, the House of Representatives passed a resolution that postponed any discussion of slavery in the House. This became known as the Gag Rule. Publishers of abolitionist newspapers faced particular violence. Their presses were smashed, and several, like Elijah Lovejoy, were murdered. Women's Rights Movement. The women's rights movement grew hand in hand with the abolitionist movement. Women couldn't vote. Most weren't educated. They didn't receive equal pay for equal work, and if they did earn money, it belonged to their husbands or fathers. Many supporters of abolition, such as the Brimke sisters, Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass, also wanted gender equality. In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton tried to attend an abolitionist convention in London, but women weren't allowed to sit with men in the main hall. Instead, they were hidden behind a curtain where they could hear but not see. She and her friend Lucretia Mott decided to organize a women's rights convention. The Seneca Falls Convention in July 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, was the first meeting of its kind. Activists drafted a declaration of sentiments and resolutions based on the Declaration of Independence to lay out the injustices in gender relations. For example, it stated that all men and women are created equal. Women didn't get the right to vote for another 70 years. Yeah, and they even show this bit right here where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. The two pillars of the women's rights movement were abolition and temperance. Women saw that alcohol abuse led to domestic problems and felt that they could relate to the status of enslaved people. Women working to end slavery began to see the parallels between their lives and the lives of enslaved people. The arguments against abolitionism and women's rights followed the same pattern. Some people argued incorrectly that people of African descent were incapable of taking care of themselves and were better off enslaved. Bullshit! Some people argued incorrectly that women were incapable of taking care of themselves and were better off being protected from the world. I'm pretty sure what we're going through nowadays when it comes to women living in a way where they could take care of themselves pretty much begs that part to differ. Hell, pretty much every non-white person are capable of taking care of themselves. Same as women. They're capable of taking care of themselves. That's not to say they can't ask for help if they feel like that's needed. In my opinion, if they need to do that, I understand it. But obviously, there has to be a really good reason behind it. Otherwise, I can't support it myself personally. Which is ironic because of what I did earlier, because of personal things that were going on, which I have discussed. And I did say I'm not going to talk about it anymore, so that's why I'm being vague about it. But if you guys want to know about it, it's in the community post, because I only had those two posts there to let you guys know what was going on, to the best of my ability without getting too into it, just to be safe on my part and my family's part. But anyway, yeah. Lucy Stone, originally a women's rights advocate, became a spokesperson for the American Anti-Slavery Society. Susan B. Anthony, like Cady Stanton, originally an abolitionist, encouraged New York State to pass laws allowing women to own property. Frederick Douglass attended the Seneca Falls Convention and endorsed the Declaration of Sentiments. The abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement had common roots, but to some extent they disagreed over which had greater priority. If you want my honest opinion, they both were equally priority. They were both of equal priority, not one over the other. I wonder if somebody were to say that to them, I wonder if they would agree with that. Some probably would, and others would be like, no, mine is important. No, mine is important. No, mine is important. No, mine is, doing that whole thing right there. But yeah. Anyway, that is the end of the fourth part of this book. Next time, we tackle the Civil War and Reconstruction. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Some of this learning the history with me. Hope you guys have a good rest of your night. And until next time, when it comes to my next reading stream, I will be reading Death Behind Every Door. But I'm going to take a break because I've read the books, all three books, back to back to back. So we'll see what tomorrow brings. I will also say, I do intend on playing more, doing the WWE 2K25 Universe mode, because I don't have any created wrestlers. which I know is a very big and a very is a very big problem going on with 2K25 right now. And to those that are impacted by that, feel I side with you. But hopefully 2K can figure out what the fuck they gotta do to get that shit taken care of. But for right now, that is going to do it for me here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you guys have a good rest of your day, your morning, your day, your night, whichever way the sun you're facing or moon. In my case, like whether you have the sun going or you have the moon. Either way, hope you guys have a good rest of your night. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Forrest Walpole signing off.